And I wish to welcome all of you to the 2019 Benjamin Eby Lecture. This is, if I have counted correctly, the 31st in a series of lectures that offers faculty at Grebel a way of sharing their ideas with the wider community. This makes accessible the fruit of their research and hopefully inspires each other and the audience towards a larger vision of the life of the mind and the spirit. The series is named after Benjamin Eby, an early bishop and educator in the Mennonite community of Upper Canada in the 1800s. It was Eby and a few people of similar stature who set the course of life in Waterloo County in the first half of the 19th century. Eby promoted education among the group descended from the Mennonites from Pennsylvania who purchased 60,000 acres of land, Block 2 of the Haldwin Tract in 1805. The college and the University of Waterloo is built on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. And this is the land that was given in treaty in 1784 to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. So as we work on building relationships with our Indigenous friends and neighbors, we at Grebel are educating ourselves and working to change our understanding of the narrative of this place. It is my real pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Dr. Mark Vuorinen, Associate Professor and Chair of Music at Conrad Grebel. After studying at Wilfrid Laurier, Mark earned a master's degree in music from Yale University School of Music and Institute of Sacred Music, and then the Doctor of Musical Arts degree from the University of Toronto. Mark is the artistic director of both the Grand Philharmonic Choir in Kitchener-Waterloo and the Elora Festival and Singers, one of Canada's premier professional choirs. He has given first performances and Canadian premieres of works by many composers, including Jonathan Dove, John Burge, Timothy Corlis, Rena Ismail, and Barbara Kroll. I'm sure many of you in this room have had the opportunity and enjoyed attending recent concerts of Mark's that have included performances of Considering Matthew Shepard, Britten's War Requiem, and Arvo Pärt's Credo. The high esteem with which he is regarded as a conductor has been publicly acknowledged by his peers. In 2016, Mark received the Leslie Bell Prize for Choral Conducting from the Ontario Arts Council and a National Choral Award for his outstanding dissertation from Choral Canada. So in addition to all his professional accomplishments, I can tell you that Mark is a wonderful colleague with a sharp sense of humor with whom we all feel very fortunate to work. Now, following tonight's lecture, you are invited to continue the conversation with Mark at the reception in Grebel's atrium. Because of the construction, the route down there today may be a little more circuitous, but we'll make sure that you can get there if you follow the people in front of you. So will you please join me in warmly welcoming Mark to the podium for his lecture, Witnessing Passion, Musical Depiction of Minor Characters in Passion Music by Bach, Ešenvalds, MacMillan and Pärt. Mark.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Troy, for that generous introduction. And thank you very much to the college for this invitation to present this lecture this evening. It's an honor to join the many faculty, colleagues who have presented their scholarship in this venue over the last 31 or so years. I'd also like to begin by thanking the musicians to my right, members of the Elora Singers, and my college colleague, Catherine Robertson, from whom you'll hear throughout the evening. There may very well be a time in which you start to tire of hearing my voice, and I'm certain, in fact, that you will not tire of hearing theirs as they illustrate some of the things in my talk this evening. I'm grateful to members of a number of my choirs over the years for the opportunity to engage musically some of the works that will be discussed in this evening's talk, particularly the Grand Philharmonic Choir. And there are several members of that choir in the audience this evening. Through its long-standing tradition of performing the major works of J.S. Bach on Good Friday, these passion works have been a musical lifeblood for as long as I can remember. As a young high schooler attending performances on Good Friday of the Passions of the then Kitchener-Waterloo Philharmonic, this was a tradition amongst my other choir-singing teenage friends. Without knowing exactly why, we were drawn to this music, to its expressive mournfulness, its drama, its beauty. We knew then that this music was special. The longer I have lived with these pieces, of course, the more I have come to realize how much more there will always be to know, to discover, and to understand about what Bach poured into their creation, about his musical genius, and significantly about his biblical exegesis. The Passion text, that is, the biblical accounts of the arrest, trial, and death of Christ, are among the most often set musically texts by composers throughout music history. These sacred texts by papal decree have been part of Holy Week liturgies since at least the 4th century. And in the 12th century, fixed pitches for the words of the evangelist Christ in the crowds had been set by using symbolic letters in the margins. These printed rubrics are the precursors to fully composed polyphonic settings which abound in the voice of all 4 gospel tellers from at least the 15th century. Known as the Passion, these texts form the backbone of the Christian faith and have served as the seeds of profound musical composition for centuries. From the middle of the 17th century, composers began to add non-biblical texts to the Passion in the form of arias and chorales and choruses, as well as independent instrumental movements. In Protestant Germany, Lutheran hymns or chorales were added, whose reflective texts and melodies would have been familiar to all congregants. It is this heritage that Bach inherited himself when he arrived in Leipzig in 1723. Through his writing of passions for the Leipzig audience of churchgoers on Good Friday, Bach has set the bar for what passion music is. I was fortunate earlier this year to spend some time in Leipzig, sitting in both the Thomaskirche, where the St. Matthew Passion was first heard in 1727, and the Nikolaikirche, where Leipzig was first introduced to Bach's St. John Passion in 1724, just a year after the cantor had first arrived, contemplating both the logistics of the performance, who sat where, and what the response of the congregation might have been. One cannot refer to a musical passion without Bach's 2 settings coming to mind, yet, of course, composers in our own centuries continue to be drawn to this story. Tonight's discussion will discuss several of them by Arvo Pärt, James MacMillan, and Ēriks Ešenvalds. But of course, there are many others. Celebrated settings by Krzysztof Penderecki, Sofia Gubajdalina, Osvaldo Golohoff, Tan Dun, and David Lang spring to mind. These works, though, today live almost exclusively in the concert hall rather than in the liturgical experience for which earlier examples were intended. But the spirit of them remains. What is it that draws composers to consider this 2,000-year-old account as a source for musical inspiration? In an increasingly secular society, how do audiences encounter this story? And what can we learn from the actions of those biblical bystanders who, in the words of the old African-American spiritual, were there when they crucified my Lord? To help answer these questions, I began to think about how the bystanders of the Passion relate to the story. Are they like extras on the set of an evolving narrative, waiting for their moment on camera and a fleeting 2 minutes of screen time? Some of them have lines, but many of them do not. Some are noted only by their presence, a short walk-on, and interaction with other players before taking their leave. In visual art, unlike music, these appearances are frozen in time. A screenshot of their presence is captured for us to consider. In studying their portrayal on canvas, what can we learn about them? In this painting, The Lamentation of the Dead Christ by Pietro Perugino from 1495, what draws the eye? To whom do we pay attention if we see it only for a moment? What if instead we visit Florence's Palazzo Pitti, where this painting resides, and spend time contemplating the figures in this painting? How do we see the figure in the bottom right corner? John's Gospel mentions him by name just once, saying that after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to take away the body of Jesus. This is all we know of Joseph of Arimathea. He speaks to Pilate, but he adds no lines. Do we notice his garments, the expensive colored fabrics, or the ornate head covering? What do we see in his eyes? A sense of duty? Is it compassion? Is it fear? What about this painting from 1604 by Giacinto Brandi? The painting is based on the same lines of text, but here Joseph of Arimathea, through lighting, is given greater centrality. The other extras, the bystanders, are not on this set. He is portrayed as an older man, portrayed with more intimacy, devotion, and love. There's no fear. Composers make decisions on how they will portray these characters and write music that overlays the same sort of characterization onto these players. In Bach's John Passion, Joseph of Arimathea is spoken of only by the evangelist. The moment is short, and like in Perugino's painting, other people are introduced into the scene. Nicodemus, we hear, comes in with 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe. Talk about stealing a scene, walking in with nearly your body weight in spices and perfume. Yet Bach has already conditioned us, the listener, to anticipate their act of kindness and duty. In an arioso for tenor and strings inserted into the narrative, just after we hear that Christ has died and the veil in the temple has been torn, the earth has quaked and the grave of the saints has been opened, the tenor has his listener consider this question: Was willst du deines Ortes tun? What will you do for your part?
Weil sie den Schöpfer Sehne kalten, was willst du deines Ortes tun?
In whose voice are these words? They're not part of the narrative. They're poetry added by Bach. But are they heard as contemporary poetry meant to inspire the congregation in Bach's cold Nikolaikirche towards some action? But imagine now that they are the thoughts of a witness to Christ's crucifixion, someone who was there that day, as the words of the old African-American spiritual ask. Who is this witness, and to what actions are they being inspired? If the congregant listens closely, Bach gives us the answer. After Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus ask for Jesus' body to be brought down, the text says in John 19:40, they took Jesus' body away and bound it in linen cloth with spices. And with these words, Bach answers the question the witness posed earlier: what will you do for your part? How do we know that he is answering that question? He uses the same music.
Dann nahmen sie den Leichnam Jesu.
Hearing these words sung to the same music as "What will you do for your part" speaks both to Bach's contemporary audience, but it also musically places Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus at the foot of the cross long before they are mentioned in the text. The musical characterization of the Passion's minor characters, and here the old adage, "there are no small roles," is apt. These are embedded in the works of Bach and of the other composers whose music is under consideration tonight. In some instances, it is the musical material itself that overlays a characterization, an interpretation, or a subtle interaction on or with a bystander, which, like Joseph of Arimathea in Perugino's painting, Lamentation over the Dead Christ, might otherwise go unnoticed. In other examples, the interpolation of non-narrative texts serves to slow the scene down, offering a window, like an aside, into the thoughts of the players on the stage. Their presence is absolutely essential. They are the reminder that this divine story is also rooted in our humanity. Tonight we'll consider the disciple Peter in detail, in a close reading of his interactions as related by Bach and Pärt and MacMillan, and we'll step into the brief spotlight of many others of the players in lesser detail. In John's account of the Passion narrative found in chapters 19 and 20, Peter's first appearance is not a particularly auspicious occasion. Peter leaves his audience, whether in a reading of the text or hearing it sung in one of the many musical settings of the John Passion, as someone who acts before he thinks. After Christ identifies himself to the soldiers, Peter reacts with his sword, striking the ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it out and struck at the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear, and the servant's name was Malchus. This is an interesting detail for the gospel writer to include, perhaps made more interesting by the fact that the matter quickly passes. Next thing we hear is that Christ is arrested by the Jewish police and bound. The gospel writer, and indeed composers who have set this text, move on quickly, and nothing more is said about this physical assault. John does not mention, as Luke does, that Jesus stops to heal the servant's ear. I, for one, would like to know more about this dramatic ear-splicing incident, but we do not hear more. The gospel writer moves right on. We only hear about it again in passing when a slave of the high priest, whose servant's ear Peter had cut off, asks the question which induces Peter's third denial, a subtle confirmation of Peter's presence at both places. We learn little about Peter in this episode in the garden, but that is about to change. In Bach's setting of the St. John Passion, the narrative stops here. He interrupts the timeline for an aside to the audience, his congregation, with the first two of 7 free poetry arias. The first, Von dem Stricken, is an anguished movement, reflecting on being bound as Christ is by the ropes of sin. 2 oboes weave around each other, binding the listener's hands in the dark music in D minor. The second, a joyful Ich folge dir, is the yang to Von dem Stricken's Ying, and follows a very brief re-entry into the narrative with this single line of text. Simon Peter, however, and another disciple follow Jesus. Bach pulls his listener aside, once again stepping out of the narrative momentarily. In Ich folge dir, the listener hears the faithful follower pledge loyalty to Christ with joyful footsteps, my life, my light. Whose words are these? Do we hear these words as the words of Peter, though they are sung by a soprano? Does the listener, Bach's 1724 congregation in the Nikolai Kirche, hear these words of reflection as their own desire to follow Christ? If they are Peter's, do we hear the joyful optimism of the flutes in B-flat major with a cloud of irony, after witnessing the impulsiveness in the garden and also knowing what lies ahead for Peter? The music is light and transparent and uses canon as a musical device to depict a joyful follower. Bach begins the aria with the same pickup and in the same key as the biblical narrative that precedes it, identifying Peter as the follower. Does this help the listener hear these words as Peter's inner thought?
Simon Petrus aber folgte Jesu nach, und ein ander Jünger.
Peter's presence in the opening arrest scene of the John Passion and Bach's portrayal of his, and by extension our, unfettered loyalty towards Christ is important to the development of Peter's character and draws important parallels when Peter comes to deny Christ just moments later in the high priest's palace. Bach here gets the whole picture. In his book, Bach's Major Vocal Works, Music, Drama, and Liturgy, Marcus Rathi notes the striking difference between Jesus' confident identification, Ich bin's, when the soldiers ask Jesus to identify himself in the garden, and Peter's parallel response, Ich bin's nicht. Christ's response is calm, confident, and harmonically sure. John's text in chapter 18, verse 4, that Christ knew all that would unfold, gives him the calm to respond this way.
Jesus spricht zu ihnen, Ich bin's.
Upon being questioned by a woman guarding the door whether he is one of Jesus' disciples, Peter's response is, I am not. The expression with which he responds to that, to make that statement, of course, cannot be known. However, Bach's setting of that text gives us a pretty good idea. As a father of 20 children, Bach undoubtedly knew how to identify a true story from a deceitful one, from a teenage son or daughter. In Bach's setting, we hear Peter's deceit.
Sprach, Ich bin's nicht.
Marcus Rathi again describes this interaction and hits the nail on the head. He says, the word I is being challenged by a dissonant chord, and the following measure lacks a bass note on the first beat altogether. An attentive listener will immediately notice that something is wrong. This is not an assertive cadence of Jesus' answer. This is not the truth. Peter is lying. In Bach's setting of the Matthew's account of the gospel, we encounter a similar reaction from Peter. This time he offers more than a dismissive "Ich bin's nicht." Rather, the text says that Peter said, "I do not know the man." Peter's interval of deceit remains the same as he lurches up the interval of a sixth. This time on the way down, Bach signals the lie through the use of parallel fifths in the bass voice. That's a harmonic no-no. And even more striking is that the cadential note is simply the wrong note. Immediately, Peter hears the cock crow, the alert that Jesus told him would signal his third denial. In a stroke of musical and visual brilliance, Bach's meticulously hand-drawn fair copy of the score shows these two lines, Peter's denial and the narrator telling us the rooster has immediately crowed identically. Peter's bass clef rendering and the evangelist's alert in the tenor clef that the cock has crowed, though separated by a perfect fifth on the page, look identical, a visual signal that Peter realizes that Christ's words have come true.
Ich kenne des Menschen nicht, und als Wort Credo der An.
From here on, Bach's two settings of the Passion give the listener a very different impression of Peter's reaction to the acknowledgement of his denial. John's gospel moves straight from Peter's third denial and the cock crowing to the beginning of Jesus' trial in front of Pilate without hearing a reaction from Peter, not unlike the scene in the garden in which Peter cut off the servant's ear. Bach, however, slows this movement down and gives the listener one of the most expressively painful moments of music ever written, as he inserts a verse from Matthew's account in which we hear that Peter wept bitterly. This moment of self-reflection doesn't appear in John's text, so Bach borrows from another source to let us know of Peter's remorse within the narrative. We learn something else about Peter in this moment as well. The text in John tells the listener on two occasions that it was cold outside and at the high priest's palace, and that Peter joined the others, slaves and police, by a fire that was lit. The musical motive Bach uses to reference the fire is the same both times, and uses a dotted rhythm with two 30-second notes, a figure which isn't seen or heard anywhere else in the work.
Simon Petrus stund und wärmete sich.
Peter's bitter weeping ends with the same figure, suggesting that in all of this guilt and grief, Peter has been frozen in the same place. He hasn't moved from the fire. This is a far cry from the Peter the listener encountered minutes earlier, eager to follow Christ in Ich folge dir, or impetuously lunging at the servant. Bach's setting of both Passion accounts close the denial scene by inserting non-narrative text following Peter's bitter weeping. And the two reactions could hardly be more different. As if to compensate for Peter's earlier naivety of a promise to joyfully follow Jesus in the John Passion, Bach interpolates an aria for tenor and strings, Ach mein Sinn, an anguished, frenetic, and self-loathing piece, in which we hear echoes of the musical motive Bach used to tell his audience that Peter was still, ironically, warming himself at the fire while frozen in guilt. Bach stretches the tenor voice to the heights of its range, and the quick, jagged rhythms in both the voice and the orchestra are uncomfortable and purposefully awkward, suggesting Peter is out of his depth. In this response, we hear not just remorse from Peter, but also anger in his own failure.
Ach mein Sinn, ach mein Sinn, wo willst du endlich hin? Wo soll ich mich ergeben?
In Bach's other passion, the Matthew, Peter's reaction to the realization he has fallen short removes the anger and the freneticism of the John passion. Bach recalls Peter's third and final denial with the beginning of the aria Erbarme dich, a rising sixth, the same interval Peter employs in his denials in both the John and the Matthew passions, begins this sorrowful aria, characterized by the virtuosic solo violin painting Peter's tears of remorse and sorrow. There is no anger here, just loss. The biblical accounts tell us little about Peter's state of mind upon denying Christ. In John, we know nothing at all. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we are told that he wept. It is through Bach's insertion of these arias, Ach mein Sinn and Erbarme dich, that we come to hear two very different responses to the crowing of the cock, and therefore differing theological interpretations of Peter's response to his own shortcomings in loyalty and devotion to Christ. In his book, Music in the Castle of Heaven, Bach authority John Eliot Gardner makes it clear for whose purpose these non-narrative assertions take place. He says, so instead of waiting impatiently for an aria to end and the story to resume, we begin to value the voice urging us to identify with the remorse, the outrage, and the outpouring of grief articulated by individual spokesmen and women in the course of the drama. Unquote. In the Bach Passions, these insertions of free poetry arias occur no fewer than 7 times in John, and twice that in the Matthew Passion. Already in the opening scene of Matthew's account, we hear that Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, and a woman pours precious water on his head, angering his disciples. Jesus scolds them, saying that she has done a good thing. Bach slows this moment down, even though the narrative has only just begun, to draw our attention to a woman whose name we don't even know. He inserts the aria Bus und Reue, a lament for alto and 2 flutes, with a melancholic descending chromatic line with jarring harmonies that signal both the woman's struggle with her place in life and her sincere humility and remorse at the feet of Jesus. The text of this aria, penitence and remorse grinds my sinful heart into pieces so that my teardrops bring forth spices acceptable to you, faithful Jesus. The Latvian composer Ēriks Ešenvalds has us recall a similar account in his work, Passion and Resurrection. The woman in Luke 7 with the alabaster jar of perfume is referenced in the musical score only. We don't actually hear these words. The music that we hear in the beginning is a quotation by the 16th century Spanish composer Cristobal de Morales, the words of which leave us with a very different impression of the scene they are meant to convey. Leave me alone, Lord. My life makes no sense. Why is man so important to you? Why pay attention to what he does? Composers' textual and musical choices not only inspire reflections on the narrative, but of course, their choices also have the potential to influence an interpretation and understanding of a scene. Bach's and Eschenwald's choice of text following similar encounters in their works leave different impressions with the listener, even before musical considerations are weighed. Consider this scene later in the Matthew Passion in which Pilate confronts a frenzied crowd. He asks which of the prisoners he should release to the crowd, Jesus or Barabbas. The back and forth between Pilate and the crowd moves quickly with short, angry bursts, resulting in a scene whose intensity accelerates. Which of the two of you do you want me to release for you? Barabbas. Then what should I do with Jesus, who's called the Messiah? Let him be crucified. Why? What evil has he done? Let him be crucified. In a bold move, Bach interrupts this back and forth and arrests the action before it ends, following Pilate's line, "What evil has he done?" Time stops, the aside itself moving in a dreamlike slow-motion sequence. Bach's response first is a recitative that considers the good that Christ has done, followed by an otherworldly aria, Aus Liebe will mein Heiland sterben. This music has no bass line. It's missing the very foundation of virtually all 18th century music. It is disengaged from the earth. The music itself comes to a complete stop 7 times in the course of its nearly 5 minutes. Who is responding to Pilate's question, "What evil has he done?" Is this Pilate's conscience speaking as he considers a response to the crowd's screams? Are these the inner thoughts of Pilate's wife, reliving the dream the listener was just told about which has caused her to suffer and motivated her to warn Pilate not to have anything to do with Jesus? Or are these the thoughts of a follower, one lost in the crowd, with the angry shouting of those nearby, making her or his tragic loss even more profound? Bach's decision to interrupt the narrative at this moment for these contemplative words and this astonishing music makes the re-entry that much more striking. Bach knows this too, and he repeats the music of the earlier chorus calling for Christ's crucifixion, this time in an intensity-raising key a full tone higher. Even in a passion narrative as long as Matthew's, Bach controls the pace of the passion to great effect, pulling at the listener's intellect and emotion, drawing his listener into the experience of these historical minor players. James MacMillan, in his St. John Passion, we will hear shortly, also uses added texts to the same great dramatic and emotional effect. But not every composer of passions interpolates added words. Yet there are ways by which we are drawn to relate to the minor players through their musical settings alone. Passio by Arvo Pärt is the composer's first major work in the tintinnabile style. It was completed in 1982 after he developed his compositional style by which the world has come to know his music. In the late 1970s, a personal crisis of purpose saw him cease composing for nearly a decade. Tintinnabile was the response. It treats 2 distinct voices, one primarily stepwise, the other triadic, to a series of intricate pre-compositional rules and procedures. The organizing plan for each piece is different, but the materials are largely the same. Here is the beginnings of a G minor scale, which could very well be the musical seeds of a Pärt composition. And it sounds like this. You can sing along too. There we go. So you can sing with the word loo. Loo, loo, loo. Here we go. Ready? And. Pärt constructs constructs his music setting the words based on the number of syllables in the words, the structure of the syntax and grammar and so on, and comes up with the shape of the melodies based on those parameters. To that he adds, he calls the melody voice, and to that he adds what he calls the tintinnabile voice, a triadic voice that is attached to this melody voice by some kind of mechanism, some rule that says which note is going to be placed next. And most often that is using what he calls first position alternating, in which you start above the closest triadic note above the melody note, followed by the closest triadic note below the melody note, and go back and forth on either side of the melody as necessary. So here's the tintinnabile voice now in the soprano. If you're sitting on this side, you can sing the melody voice, and if you're sitting on this side, you could sing the tintinnabile voice. Let's start with the tintinnabile voice. We haven't practiced that yet. 3, 4. When you put those two voices together, they sound like this. 3, 4. Already you begin to hear consonants and dissonance coming at various times, having nothing to do with what the text is going to be about, because it's all dictated ahead of time by these rules that he sets. Now you can easily create a 4-part structure or texture out of this material by adding a bass voice, and what he does with the bass voice, one of the things he might do with the bass voice is use an inversion, and so the bass voice is going exactly opposite as what the alto voice is doing, right? So if you're sitting over here, you could be the bass voice, right? And it goes down, 3, 4. And to that you get another tintinnabile voice, so now we have a 4-voice texture also in the first position alternating. And you and I and all of us have just written a piece by Arvo Pärt that can be published very soon. It goes like this, 3, 4. Well done. Good. At the heart of Pärt's setting is the text of the Gospel of John. The composer has poignantly married the biblical text to the musical structures used to relate it. He has linked the text with the music, so prophetically that it in fact would be impossible to separate them. Yet paradoxically, one could listen to virtually any isolated moment of Passio and have no way of knowing whether the music was describing Peter's effort to warm himself by a fire, as we just heard in Bach's John Passion, or Christ being crucified on Golgotha. Though the dramatic content of these two textual examples is decidedly different, the musical material for both examples is almost virtually identical. Pärt eschews all temptation to paint the narrative through compositional language. There are no chorales to interject the contemporary response of the congregation, as in Bach, or reflective texts to help us get into the heads of the players on the stage. When we encounter Peter at his denials, we aren't even treated to an interpolation of Matthew's gospel to know that he wept bitterly after making the third denial. In John, Peter's voice is heard only twice. Though there are 3 denials, the listener hears about the third only from the narrator. Pärt's tonal plan in Passio uses different key areas for different people or groups of people. The narration, sung and played by a quartet of vocal soloists and 4 instruments, are centered on A, using a tintinnabile voice in A minor. Jesus and Pilate, the only 2 characters to be sung by individual voices, have their own tonal plans. And the voice of Peter and the cries of the crowd, both sung by the choruses, have tintinnabile voices employing E major triadic pitches with a reflecting pitch for the melody voice on B. Recalling that Pärt's pre-compositional design set out the rules by which every word is set, Peter's 2 denials consisting of just 2 words, non sum, both 1 syllable long, creates a remarkably static response. His I am not consists of just two E major chords with different spellings. In this example, we hear the narrator, the evangelist, which is sung by a quartet, say, sing "He denied it and said," and then you'll hear "Non sum," I am not, from Peter. What do we make of the voice of Peter being treated in 4 parts? Like Bach, Pärt gives the voice of the crowds to the chorus. This makes sense. The collective voice of the crowd is louder, bolder than the voice of the individual. Yet Peter's non sum, the small, scared voice frozen by the fire presented in a strong 4-voice choral rendering, makes the denial a direct reflection of the accusation. Why make Peter a plural when both Jesus and Pilate are individuals? In Pärt's Peter, are we all both the accusers and the deniers? Regardless of whether Pärt's inclusion of the plural Peter was a theological decision or a musical one, there is little to be discerned about Peter's state of mind by his response. The listener is left to wonder whether Peter feels sorrowful by his denial or anger in his own weakness, or perhaps lucky just to have gotten out of the scene unscathed. The only indication whatsoever that something has gone astray follows the narrator's telling of the 3rd denial when we hear the cock crow. The moment is signaled by the alto evangelist singing only in A pitch for the words of, "and at that moment the cock crowed." This voice breaks from the expected pattern of melody voice being reflected in inversion with the bass voice. The alto voice also hangs on through the cadence into the instrumental measure, marking the end of the scene. The term holy minimalism has been applied to Pärt's music and to that of other composers who have gravitated towards simpler musical resources and sacred texts. It is not, however, a term that he encourages himself or recognizes in his own music. Nevertheless, a single A-pitch pedal held to represent the crowing of a rooster must be the most minimalist ever such cock-a-doodle-doo ever composed in a passion setting. Yet its unexpected presence signals that something is not right. In this way, it's no different than Bach's parallel fifths, or on Peter's denial in Matthew, or the dissonant continual chord in the John Passion of Bach. In Pärt's setting, Peter's voice does not reveal his character. Rather, Peter becomes one small but important part in an ever-evolving drama whose conclusion is known from the opening notes. Peter's setting implies an important perspective of Johannine theology. His compositional design, of which Peter is a part, utilizes both small-scale and large-scale chiastic constructions and gives prominence to the gospel writer's observances in John 18:4 that Christ knows all that will occur in the events leading to his crucifixion. Seen in this light, the Passion narrative unfolds according to a preordained scheme. In this subtle perspective of the gospel that Arvo Pärt, it is this subtle perspective of the gospel that Arvo Pärt reveals in his Passio. In this, Peter plays his part. Pärt is deliberate in revealing chiastic systems in Passio. The figure Pontius Pilate, who has so much to say in John's gospel, likewise becomes part of a larger structural system, which is not fully revealed until all of his lines have been sung. It is only in hindsight and on close inspection that it becomes visible at all. Pärt uses the extensive dialogue of Pilate during Christ's trial to reveal another layer of his chiasm. Pärt's 15 entrances, 15 separate lines of text, are always accompanied by the organ. The texture of this accompaniment changes throughout the work, as does the type of vocal line that Pärt creates for Pilate to sing. This is not so important. What is important to Pärt's chiastic design are the 7 of Pilate's 15 phrases that are accompanied by a pedal tone. Here you see the pitches of the pedal tone and their relative location in the score. Pilate's tonal centers on B and F, so pedal tones on those pitches are not surprising. What is unique, however, is that the central pedal tone at rehearsal 105 is not on B or F, but rather on E. This pitch is theologically significant in Passio, as it is both the medial tonal center of the work and also the tonal center of the words of Christ. You can see down below. It is on this entrance at rehearsal 105 that Pilate reveals to the crowds that he has reconciled with the truth. About Christ, Pilate says, "Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." In this very subtle use of pedal, Pärt symbolically acknowledges Pilate's role in the unfolding events. One might think that the use of an E pedal at this point is striking, and indeed, the dissonance is created as the E pedal collides with the F major triadic pitches of Pilate's tintinnabile voice are extraordinary. But the listener cannot possibly be aware of the tonal centricity of that E pedal until Pilate has delivered all 15 of his entrances. It's only in hindsight that a listener can be aware that Pilate's role in this passion, like Peter's, has been unfolding as part of a greater scheme. Scottish composer James MacMillan is arguably among the most prolific of Passion composers since Bach, and certainly of living composers. His early works, Visitatio Sepulchri and The Seven Last Words of Christ from the Cross, both from 1993, are not precisely Passion works, though they are concerned with the suffering and death of Christ. MacMillan has composed 2 full Passion settings using John in 2007 and Luke 2013, respectively, as the texts. Between these 2 Passions, he composed an extraordinary work very much connected to Passion music in general and to his John Passion in particular, called Since It Was the Day of Preparation. This work is a setting of John's Gospel after Christ is crucified and begins precisely where the St. John Passion left off. Joseph of Arimathea, asking Pilate if he might take the body of Jesus, is the first character we meet. These works, both settings of John's texts, are of interest to this discussion. Like Bach, MacMillan composed the St. John Passion using the text of John's Gospel with textual interpolations meant to provide reflection on what has just happened in the narrative. And while Bach favored the familiar Lutheran chorale and free poetry for his reflective texts, MacMillan, a devout Catholic, turned to his own tradition for words and music with which to punctuate the narrative of John's Gospel. Verses from Tenebrae, the Reproaches, and the Stabat Mater, familiar penitential Catholic texts, root this concert work in MacMillan's own spiritual and theological sphere. And from time to time, ancient melodies of Latin plainsong are embedded into the fabric of the works. In MacMillan's John Passion, there is just one soloist, a baritone who sings the words of Jesus. All other minor characters are sung by a variety of different choral groupings. The narration is sung by a small ensemble of 8 to 24 singers. MacMillan's publisher, Boosey and Hawkes, indicates that this choir should be of a professional standard, a qualification that is not lost upon hearing the intricacy of the evangelist's musical material. A large symphony chorus of 80 to 120 singers is required for the non-evangelist voices, such as Peter, Pilate, and the crowds. Like Pärt, MacMillan's Peter is a plural, Peters, and the numbers specified by the publisher are necessary for the sake of balance against the very large orchestra. So what do we make of the voice of Peter in MacMillan's John Passion? Do we learn anything new about this character? The scoring of Peter's voice is for the tenor and basses of the large choir, split into 4 parts. The voices enter one after each other, their entrances plucking out an unstable diminished 7th chord. The rhythmic disunity only intensifies as the denial progresses, taking a full 6 measures for the 4-voice polyphony to agree on a final pitch, an F sharp. Not unlike Bach's wrong note in his Peter, MacMillan's 21st century harmonic and rhythmic conflict tell the listener that something isn't quite right about Peter's answer. But there is something else, too. In Peter's two denials, the voices are accompanied by 3 trumpets, 4 horns, who play with military, fanfare-like precision, a striking juxtaposition against the voice of Peter's "I am not." Stay with me. While Peter's denial begins in a cagey manner, it soon erupts into a show of power and strength. In MacMillan's denial, the plural Peter is not only shifty, as Bach's was, but he is defiant also. This is a character trait we haven't seen in the other 3 settings of Peter's denial heard earlier. In MacMillan, Peter's 2 denials contain the same music, replete with the same dishonesty and the same defiance. Is the brazenness of Peter's denial intentional? Where is the remorse? Where is the self-disappointment we hear in Bach's John Passion, or the sense of mourning and loss in Bach's Matthew Passion? To be sure, there are other bold and frenetic elements of the music that surround the narration that lead to these outbursts. The Stravinsky woodwind writing, for example, that accompanies the narrator's assertion that Peter was about to deny Christ for the first time, could be easily have been borrowed from the ritualized score of The Rite of Spring. But these brass fanfares seem far too deliberate at this point to be unintentional and without extra musical meaning. If there was any doubt of the characterization of Peter's denials, confirmation arrives upon his realization that he has denied Christ 3 times, just as he was told he would do. Nope. There we go. After several seconds of bone-chilling silence, the truth of Peter's shortfall hits him, with all of the obvious predictability of the transgression. We are struck by the impact of the trumpet section and the battery of percussion arpeggiating in F-sharp minor at a dynamic level of 3 Fs. F-sharp, we recall, is the same pitch on which Peter's dodgy denials eventually landed, though the narrations that surround it are centered on C natural, a tritone away. To add irony to Peter's insulting realization that he has done exactly what he said he would not do, MacMillan concludes the scene with a non-narrative text, a reflection filling the same role as that of Bach's Erbarme dich had in the Matthew Passion. This reflection, though, stings like salt in a wound. It does not contain the universality of Bach's Erbarme dich with its text reminiscent of the Agnus Dei. MacMillan has the chorus crash into the fanfare with the subtlety of a lumbering freight train, expounding the words and then the melody of the ancient Latin hymn, Tu es Petrus. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. These are the words bestowed upon Peter by Jesus in Matthew 16. They are familiar to Peter. They are words of trust and responsibility. They come flashing back to Peter to close this scene, making the awkward realization of Peter's denials hurt that much more deeply. In MacMillan's setting, these words are aimed directly at him. In an interview with Bethany Alvey, James MacMillan says this about the excerpt just described. At the end of that movement, I'm going to have the choir singing the papal hymn, Tu es Petrus. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. There's a tongue-in-cheek association presenting that flawed person and then all of this papal glory simultaneously. But there's a drama in that conflict which goes straight to the heart of the conflict in the church. We'll hear that now. In the same interview with Alvey, MacMillan goes on to say, "I think it's a beautiful thing that Peter was chosen, because he was a very flawed individual. He reminds me of all of us. He was a coward, a traitor, a man that couldn't stand up for his friend, and yet he was made the foundation of the church." And that is the point of these flawed human interactions, being part of this divine account. A beautiful thing that Peter, as defiantly flawed as he is, as portrayed by MacMillan, how naively impetuous he was shown to be in Bach's St. John Passion, and so full of remorse in Bach's Matthew Passion. There is something of Peter in all of us. Peter, it must be stated, sticks around. Despite the incident with Malchus in the garden, despite falling asleep on the mountain while Jesus prayed in Matthew's account, despite being paralyzed in fear by the fire, and despite the 3 denials in front of unfriendly crowds, Peter remained to the end. John's gospel places Peter as one of the first to arrive at the empty grave. James McClellan keeps Peter in focus in the 2011 work Since It Was the Day of Preparation, a work that considers this period after Christ's resurrection. It is much more muted than his St. John Passion, scored for just a handful of instruments and 5 singers. Even in the end, Peter's humanity is on full display. In the final scene of the work, musically depicting John's account of Jesus appearing to the disciples on the beach as they fished, we are struck by impetuous Peter jumping into the sea while the others came to shore by boat. Peter is soon asked 3 times by Jesus if he loves him. The music MacMillan uses to ask this question is mystical, accompanied by the harp and theorbo, a Renaissance-era plucked string instrument, and quotes the melody of a 13th century hymn by Thomas Aquinas, Pange Lingua Gloriosi. The music is warm and secure. Peter, though, is hurt that Jesus asked the question 3 times. There is, of course, both precedent and parallel for these questions, and to the denials that we heard earlier. Peter's response changes key. It's accompanied by a cold trio of clarinet, horn, and cello. With Jesus' response following Peter's 3rd assertion that he loves him, MacMillan embeds a familiar melody. Some 23 years before writing the St. John Passion, while he was a penny whistle playing member of the Scottish folk music group Broadstone, MacMillan wrote a song known as The Tryst to a love poem by William Souter. At this time, MacMillan worked as a school teacher and composed only as a hobby. He later recorded the song with Scotland's traditional music ensemble, the Whistle Winkies, on their album Timber Tamber. I included this piece in the talk just so I could say both the name of that group and the name of the album. I'll repeat it, the Whistle Winkies, Timber Tamber. Here we go. Musical language of this tune, like a folk song, is decidedly simpler than the musical language that propels the narrative of his passion works forward. This beautiful melody would come to be a leitmotif for MacMillan as it returns to become central to many of his works. To MacMillan, the word tryst and its association to this melody represents a coming together. Robert Weitzman, in the liner notes to a 1999 album of MacMillan's work by the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, relates that tryst strongly infers an intimate encounter sanctified by loving commitment, a covenant, a pledge. In his St. John Passion, we hear this melody in both minor and major modes on Christ's death in a lengthy postlude to the work. And since it was the day of preparation, this melody returns almost unrecognizably, plucked on the ancient-sounding theorbo, accompanying Jesus' words to Peter. It is MacMillan's recognition that in all of Peter's missteps, denials, and impetuous acts, there is yet compassion, redemption, and hope.
Simon, son of John, do you love me? Do you love me?
Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him,
Everything, you know that I love you.
Jesus said to
Feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you guarded yourself and walked where you would. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will guard you and carry you where you do not wish to go.
Through several centuries of passion music, we have encountered the musical stories of those who were there. The gospel accounts are full of witnesses to the arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Christ. The women with the precious water, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, Pilate, Peter, and of course there are many others. Often their presence is distilled into a single line of text. In musical settings of the Passion, that single line of text may result in just a single measure of music. Yet their presence as eyewitnesses is absolutely essential. They are the reminder that this divine story is also deeply human. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. When this lecture series was conceived, it was to encourage us to have a larger vision of mind and spirit, and I think that definitely happened this evening. Thank you to Lindsay, Christina, Steve, and Rich, and Catherine for your leadership tonight as well. We'll take a few minutes now for you to engage Mark with the topic, and the singer, perhaps even the singers, you could ask them some questions and take the conversation even further at this point.
Do you have a hunch why E major would be the central, the hub of some of those passages in the Pärt?
I do. Avert your eyes, sorry. As you can see from come back up here. As you can see from the bottom of this slide, there's a centrality to E, right? It's equidistant to D and F on either side, and also from B and A on the far sides, right? The interval from B to E is a fourth, and from A to E going in the same opposite direction is also a fourth. And D to E are seconds, and the distance between B and D is a third, so there's symmetry there. There is some thought that those numbers in particular were chosen because 2, 3, and 4 are the ratios of the cross, thought by some. I'm not sure whether Pärt had that in mind or not, actually, but certainly that centrality of the entire work is conceived with these, as I described in very small detail, chiastic constructions. That is, things that look forwards and backwards. So this is just one example of that. Pilate's pedal tone, right? This is a very subtle thing that if you might just think that the organist slipped a note and played the wrong pedal. But in looking at the whole thing, you see it's B, F, B, F, E. B, F, B, it all points into the middle. You can't possibly know these things are central until the work is finished, because you need the beginning and the end to see the whole picture, right? So E has that special moment, that special centrality.
Jim.
Mark, when you're preparing the choir to sing these works, this is very, very interesting, but is it important to help a choir understand, the notes of singing, that this is going on?
Yeah.
Can you do that?
Not to this level of detail. Otherwise, there would never be a concert. But I think it is. I think it is important that the singers recognize these things. These are certainly elements that Bach were in Bach's mind as he composed them. And so for a singer to understand that notion, I think, is really important. And what I was drawn, as I was thinking of a topic months ago of what to talk about tonight, this came to mind. And again, I thank the Grand Philharmonic Choir, because I grapple with presenting these works from time to time. They are deeply spiritual works, they are deeply theological works, and not everybody shares that theology, that belief, and they encounter these works in a variety of ways, in various ways. And I think identifying to these smaller characters, to know that they are pained, to know that they have gone through this very real human interaction of denying somebody that you love because it's easier that way. Who among us has not done that? It's a very human thing to have happen. And so to be able to relate to those sorts of things, I think, is really important for our choir. And so we discussed, that sort of nature in our rehearsals. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could suggest any materials for further study into the kind of theory and theology of these works. You mentioned a couple of books.
Absolutely. I could. The Music in the Castle of Heaven by John Eliot Gardner is fantastic for Bach. Paul Hillier writing on Arvo Pärt is kind of the he was the first one to sort of do the analysis to figure out that Pärt is so mathematical and so on. If you want a more philosophical and sort of philosophical approach, the Peter Buteneff's book, whose name, with the title of which isn't in my head right now, but Peter Buteneff, who's a faculty member at St. Vladimir's Seminary, Orthodox Seminary in New York. You could read my dissertation. You would be the 5th or 6th person to do so. I'd be happy to supply other names too. We could talk afterwards. If you like. Yeah. Yes?
Thanks so much for bringing to light the ways in which these different composers are doing exegesis within their own works. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about their different approaches to reaching their audience, because they all have very different musical language that's attempting to bring the audience in, but in different ways, right? I'm struck especially by Pärt, who seems to be denying us any emotive response, right? That what he's trying to give us is nothing. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that. And also Pärt, because Pärt's also this fascinating, in a way similar to Bach, in that he's using something that might be familiar to an audience, but twisting it. Right?
Yeah. I guess to your first point, you're right. There is a sort of denial of aesthetic in Pärt. I mean, and that's what has drawn people to his music. That's where the term holy minimalism comes from, right? He is drawn to these sacred texts and to spiritual ideas and so on, but his musical materials are very, very sparse. And it's in that sparsity, I think, that we find beauty. You cannot begin. Pärt's music is full of consonance and dissonance, as you all engaged with, as you sang. You could maybe feel the rubbing of major or minor seconds with the person sitting beside you. That sort of vibration of sound as close intervals take place, as opposed to the consonant intervals, the ones that sound nice and stable and secure. They come in and out. And in Pärt's music, those dissonances are never aligned with anything in particular, whereas Bach uses dissonance on the word knirscht in that aria I referenced, Buß und Reue, knirscht meaning to grind. My penitence and remorsefulness grinds. Two very entirely different languages, and so Pärt is far more esoteric, and I think it helps to sort of do the math work that's required to understand what Pärt is doing to sort of get it. But even in its sparsity, there's also an immediacy to it because the materials are so simple. There's a second point to your question, and I can't remember what it was.
What's McClellan doing with,
Oh, yeah.
with the chant? I mean, it's similar and different to what Bach does.
Right. Certainly in the case of Bach, using those materials, like the Lutheran chorale, those chorales would be known by every congregant at that service on Good Friday, and in fact, those chorale verses might be the 18th verse of the hymn or the 21st verse of the hymn, and those congregants would have known those words. In MacMillan's case, writing concert music in the 21st century, his audience is not necessarily going to be aware that he's quoting Thomas Aquinas' hymn from the 13th century, but I think there is something familiar about it. As Rich was singing those words, you may not have been aware that was Aquinas' melody, but there's something oddly familiar or oddly comfortable about it. And so I think MacMillan, uses those texts or those musical resources in that way. His own use of that beautiful folk melody is just astonishing, and I keep stumbling upon it the more I study MacMillan's music. And I urge you to listen to the St. John Passion. I'll tell you that the first number of times that I listened to that piece from start to finish, I wanted to turn it off. Because it's very abrasive. It's very in your face the whole time. Jesus is angry. Pilate is angry. Peter is angry. Everybody, the orchestration is just frenetic, and there's just so much sound. And then you get to the point at which Christ dies, and there's a 10-minute postlude, an instrumental postlude. There are no words. But he subtexts the postlude with a title, which is text that comes from the reproaches, Good Friday, part of the Good Friday liturgy. And here he brings back that melody, first in the minor, as we heard the theorbo playing it on the piano just a minute ago. And then there's a whole polyphonic section, an imitative section that's based on a melody that he uses in his setting of the Miserere, Psalm 51. And then we get a full-blown brass version of that hymn tune, and it just puts you on your, like, it just knocks you over after hearing the freneticism and anger and full out emotion of the passion, and then you hear that melody sort of coming through like a John Williams movie. Like, it really is very cinematic. It kind of rises up from the bottom, and it's big trumpet sounds, and all of a sudden you're in this different place, and then it comes to an end. It's a really, really powerful moment. If you listen to anything of that piece, just listen to the last movement.
Well, thank you again, Mark. Let's give him another warm round. Again, we can, if you can, more questions may dawn on you as you join us in the atrium for some light refreshments. We can go through the door down there and to the stairs, and I don't want to direct you into the pit outside. So maybe there'll be ushers down there to you. But thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thanks again, Mark, and have a good evening. Thank you.